through history, through what we commemorate here today. These soldiers and what they did on these beaches helped build those post-war institutions that he challenges. So on many levels, ceremonial, personal, and political, this is a really important trip for President Trump.
And Terry, we just saw his two sons. He has been traveling with his family on this trip. At Buckingham Palace, we saw Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner on the balcony. And today here we see his sons there in the front row with some of those World War II veterans I spoke of who've made this journey. And Terry, you talk about the president who so often talks about America first, but this trip really has been about this alliance, not only with the UK, but with Europe, which has been tested under this administration, as we know. He has talked about NATO paying its fair share, of course. So he has tested that alliance, but he has also, on this trip, made it clear that it's a partnership he wants to keep. It's one that he celebrated with the Queen, with leaders of both Britain and France, as he now prepares to honor these veterans with President Macron here in France.
Absolutely. That's a great distinction to draw. President Trump has a different idea of those post-war institutions that were built out of this heroism that we commemorate today, NATO and the UN and World Bank. He's got a different idea about that, and there's going to be fights about that. But that underlying solidarity, transatlantic solidarity that was forged in World War II, he believes in that. There's no question about that. He has to, because we do, the people of France and the United States and Britain and the United States, still feel very close to one another. I remember right after 9/11, I was covering the White House, and Tony Blair came to visit, and the British press corps came. And I remember a British reporter, an older man, grabbed my arm, and he said, this is 2 weeks after 9/11, "You were there for us, we'll be there for you." And I think regardless of the presidency or the issues of the day, that alliance is really buried deep, lodged deep in the hearts of people on both sides of the Atlantic.
We are expecting now to see both President Trump and the First Lady, Melania Trump, and the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and the First Lady, Brigitte Macron. We saw her moments ago hugging dignitaries as they arrived here. We also saw that sweeping shot of Omaha Beach, and Cokie Roberts is with us for our coverage of this 75th anniversary of D-Day this morning. And Cokie, you and I were talking about your trips to Normandy in the past, that you walked that beach, you talked to the veterans yourself, and one of the things that struck me is that you had mentioned the cliffs, and they really are extraordinary here when you think about what those young men did.
They really are. I was there for the 50th anniversary, and I went down on the beach to report from there, and you look up at those cliffs and you think, how on earth did anyone survive this? I mean, think about it, David. This invasion was a city. It was 125,000 troops arriving, and the Germans just shooting down at them from the heights, and people having to step over dead bodies to get through the water onto the beach, and then get up that cliff and get into France and then move through the hedgerows on into Europe. It's an extraordinary feat and well worth remembering anytime we can.
We're looking at that beach right now, just a beautiful day here in Normandy, and I have to point out that this was not the forecast for these World War II veterans when they arrived here in Normandy. It was to be raining today, but the weather cooperating as we look out on what is a stunning cemetery, a solemn one, a powerful one, but a stunning one indeed. You can see the American flags, many of them put there by American companies. We know Annan, for one. Those flags made in America, they brought them all this way to place them in front of those crosses made of marble, and the French flags as well. And you can see the faces of the World War II veterans gathered right at the front, where they should be, applauding as they learn the leaders of both the United States and of France and of several other countries now arrive to pay tribute. the applause as the people who have gathered here for this ceremony see the faces of those World War II heroes who have made the journey back to Normandy up on the big screens here, right here at the American Normandy Cemetery. And our Chief Global Affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, is watching the coverage along with all of us here in Normandy. And Martha, I know you're just back from Iran yourself, so you're joining us via the phone now, but you have been to Normandy as well. And you get chills when you see the faces of these heroes. They are quiet and humble, as I mentioned at the top. But many of them say it's not been until recently that they have felt comfortable talking about what it was they witnessed, what it was they accomplished, and their real hope now that the generations behind them will pay attention today, not necessarily because it was these veterans who did this, but because of the real place in history and what it meant. It changed the course of history.
It certainly did, David. And looking at these faces and listening to your interviews with those veterans, I love what you just said. The veterans thought of the brothers they lost. And that is exactly what they do. And that is exactly what American soldiers do. That is why they fight. But looking at those faces, those elderly faces, I can't help imagining what they were like on that day, in that era. I can look at them squeezing their eyes shut and know what they are thinking about right now, know what that means to them to be there and remembering that time so long ago. And they were standing with their brothers when they watched their brothers die next to them. It is humbling for anyone who goes there. It is humbling for anyone who walks that beach, which I have done as well, and looked up at those cliffs as Cody did and you did, and realized how profound that was in history and for each and every one of those men and their children and their grandchildren who are now, as you say, just starting to realize, some of them, what their grandfathers went through and how powerful a time that was. The greatest generation, as we often say.
You know, these veterans on the beach, as they've traveled back to Omaha Beach and some of the other beaches during this trip here, it's been remarkable to witness the perfect strangers who've approached them. I mentioned the one woman in tears, but there have been so many families here, many of the French, because they were so directly affected by what it was these soldiers did, these American soldiers who stormed the beach, basically liberated, certainly this part of France, from the Nazis immediately and before they moved deeper into France. But that was a resounding applause. Everyone was on their feet when they saw the faces of those veterans. Again, just a picture of the day. You see the blue sky there, just a few clouds. We're expecting several flyovers this morning. The French anthem and the American national anthem moments from now, as they see the leaders of both France and the United States and from around the world come and pay tribute to these veterans who are now, as I mentioned earlier, well into their 90s. The Americans themselves sent 73,000 troops. And as we all know, 4,000 Allied troops were killed on that day. 2,500 of them were Americans who paid with their lives that day. And as Martha mentioned, one of the things we heard so often in our interviews in the preceding weeks with these veterans is that they have thought for years that they were the lucky ones. They've thought about their brothers that they lost, the friends that they lost, and that they were allowed somehow to go back home and build the middle class in America, have families, have careers, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But to this very day, they think about the brothers who, many of whom are buried right here in this cemetery. Harold McMurrin of Alabama told me, we don't dwell on it, but I do think about it. And he said that as he sat here in the cemetery with me. He said, I think about it because they're right here with me right now. Cokie Roberts watching along with us here. Powerful and quiet, this ceremony. But you had mentioned as well that so many of the veterans you've talked with kept their stories to themselves for so long.
Walking through that cemetery with the veterans is just incredibly moving, because they're looking at the graves of their buddies, and of course their buddies were 18, 19, 20 years old and lost, and they're still remembering them so well all these years later. I remember one veteran saying to me as he looked out over that very beautiful cemetery with all those crosses, saying, he looked at me and he said, "So they say you can win a war." And he was feeling that that wasn't true, but of course we did. We did win that war, and it was terribly important for the rest of our century and beyond. It did create the world we've lived in since.
You talk about the veterans who weren't convinced that they would win, and in fact they did, but General Eisenhower, though he put on a brave face that night when he ordered the D-Day invasion, also wondered if there could be failure, and he prepared for it. And there was a letter that he wrote on that night, on the eve of June 6th. It was June 5th, obviously, and he wrote a letter. He was prepared to deliver it to the public had things gone much differently on June 6th. Part of that letter read, "Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." That was what General Eisenhower was prepared to say, Koki. He never had to say it. And in fact, he forgot that he wrote that until he found it tucked inside his pocket about a month later.
It's one of the most extraordinary documents, I think, in American history. It's right up there with George Washington surrendering his command at the end of the Revolutionary War, of a general taking responsibility and saying, "It's mine alone." It's a really important object lesson for our leaders from there on out. Responsibility is mine.
Extraordinarily important, and a lesson to be prepared for failure, but also to embrace a victory when you see one. And in fact, one of the World War II veterans, Harold Himmelsbach, told me that he'll never forget. It was about a week after D-Day, being right here, Highway 13. We saw it on our drive in. When he was at his foxhole, he saw the generals coming his way, and he looked up and he began waving at the generals, he told me, when he realized one of them was General Eisenhower. And to this day, he had a giant smile on his face, Terry Moran, telling me that he was waving at his future president.
Dwight Eisenhower had his own smile. He had the grin that helped make him president, and his charisma was one of capability. He was an enormously capable officer his entire career. And there was a warmth to him. His soldiers were willing to go where they had to for him. They trusted him, as did the country. He won 2 overwhelming victories. He was a figure that, as Queen Elizabeth said just the other day, she said that she knew him and made his acquaintance, of course, as president and before when he was general. She is the last world leader who actively participated in World War II. She was a mechanic and truck driver in the auxiliary service. As soon as she turned 18 in 1945, she joined up. And so she knew Eisenhower. She knew Churchill very well, of course. And she is a living witness to this history, as we saw there. And Eisenhower still, in her words, is present in these days. It was really remarkable to hear her speak at the state banquet about that.
I mean, it really landed, Terry. I mean, when you hear the Queen talk about her contemporaries in General Eisenhower and in Churchill, that when she says she appreciates what these World War II veterans accomplished here on the beaches of Normandy, it landed for them, and it landed around the world.
It did, and she's, as she said, in a rare reference to herself in that speech in Portsmouth yesterday, she said, "The wartime generation, my generation, is resilient," she said, and that certainly is the case. And she does talk about those years as if they were just yesterday. She talks about Churchill, I've heard in speeches and interviews, almost as if he just walked out of the room. Churchill was born when Ulysses Grant was president of the United States. That's how much history she touches and embodies. And so I think that was one of the reasons President Trump was somewhat in awe of her. You could tell that. It was remarkable watching them both.
Well, it's funny, Terry Moran says here this morning that she speaks about it as if it were recent history, and it's one of the powerful lessons of why we're here today. It really was only 75 years ago that the Allied troops and thousands of Americans among them changed the course of history. And as we watch these landings here, Martha Raddatz with us, and Martha, you know about these veterans and how humble they have been for so long, and that it took many, many years before they were comfortable in sharing what it was they witnessed here. Many of them telling me that when they got that call early in the morning, for one of them it was 3 a.m., they woke up on that ship. They were told to have breakfast, get their gear. He said he went up on deck, and that was when the first explosion hit. He was up in the air, and by the time he had his bearings back on the deck, the second explosion, he said, was even worse than the first. And when he finally got his bearings, he realized that one of the three that he had had breakfast with, he'd already lost in that first explosion. And that was something that he and many of these veterans simply did not share about what it was they witnessed until many, many years later.
And that's what people did in that era. I mean, today we have the benefit of therapies, of whatever we can do for veterans to help them tell their stories, those who suffer from post-traumatic stress. Our urge to talk about it, our urge to remember, our urge to tell people. But that generation just did not. They felt they needed to keep it to themselves, and as you said, they were survivors. They felt grateful to be alive. They still do, that they want to carry on and show how grateful they are. I've seen these veterans, these current era of veterans, meet those veterans from World War II. They are so grateful and so humble to see them. When I walked through Normandy, I was on what's called an Army staff ride, and I was with Army historians telling us all about the battle and how those troops approached, and how many were not just shot, but many of those troops getting off of those vessels out in the ocean drowned. You can imagine them approaching this beach, and their boats are shot up, and they are in the water. That's the kind of stories they hear. When I walked there, I was with the first living recipient of the Medal of Honor since Vietnam, Sal Junta, and it had just been announced he would be receiving the Medal of Honor. Barack Obama announced that, and Sal walked those beaches. Sal was 25 years old when he was in Afghanistan, and tears were streaming down his face when we walked through that cemetery, when we saw those crosses and Star of David's walking through that cemetery. And that evening, when we walked up to the cemetery to lower the flag, a Korean War veteran approached Sal. He did not know who Sal was. Sal was in civilian clothes, looked like a college kid. And he scolded him and said, "Don't you know how to fold a flag, son?" And Sal just stopped. And the general who was with us at the time, Carter Hand, said, "Sir, thank you so much for coming over to us. This is Sal Junta, the recipient of the Medal of Honor."
Wow. And that is the real bond between all of these veterans of different generations. And Martha, I just want to interrupt you just for a moment, because we're watching French President Macron and Brigitte Macron greet President Trump and Melania Trump here. There were applause as the French president arrived and walked across the lawn to greet the American president. The world watching these interactions very closely. We all remember the first time President Trump and President Macron met after President Trump was elected, and the handshake, and so much attention paid to that handshake and how long they held on to one another. But make no mistake, today they are here, and there is a bond. There is a bond over what the troops accomplished here in France. And as I mentioned before, there is profound gratitude here. Gratitude back home in the States for what these veterans have done, but there is profound gratitude for what the American soldiers, the American troops who stormed the beaches of Normandy did 75 years ago. Let's watch as the First Ladies approach.
Step moving, please. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the arrival of the official party. President Emmanuel Macron, President of the Republic of France, and Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States.
Mesdames et messieurs, veuillez vous lever pour l'arrivée des représentants officiels. De M. Emmanuel Macron, président de la République française, et de M. Donald J. Trump, président des États-Unis.
President Trump and President Macron both greeting those World War II veterans, the first two on the stage, and you saw that one saluting his commander-in-chief, President Trump. And Terry Moran, as I mentioned earlier, much had been made about the relationship between these two leaders early on. They'd both been elected on very different platforms, but the two have found enough common ground, and certainly they're on common ground today.
They are, and their relationship has cooled a little bit, but they were both disruptors of their political system. Obviously, President Trump in America, but also Emmanuel Macron in France came out of nowhere, invented his own party, and won the presidency. He's struggling a little bit right now in a way that President Trump is not, but there's no question that they see each other as outsiders. That was their original bond. Also, there was a kind of macho competition on who could shake each other's hand harder. But now they have these different approaches, so they are certainly at odds on some issues, climate change and the role of these post-war internationalist institutions. But here, you're absolutely right. There's no question the President of France and the President of the United States at this cemetery are very close, no matter who they are.
If we only had a microphone on the president as he greets some of these World War II veterans, you can see the smiles on their faces. Some of them I recognize. Jack Claiborne right there. He's from Dyersburg, Tennessee, and we've been spending weeks with him as he prepared for this trip. Yesterday, he was telling me he was back down on Omaha Beach, and someone walked up to him and handed him a bouquet of flowers and simply said, "Thank you." And he said that meant the world to him. He said they then asked, "Can we give you a hug?" And he said, "Absolutely." I saw Harold McMurrin there, too. A couple rows back with a smile on his face, his eyes trained on the president. And he was the one who told me about an hour before he made this trip, he had second thoughts. Should he do it? This was his first trip back to Normandy, and he told me yesterday he's sure glad he did it. Many of these World War II veterans have been very open about the closure this trip has provided, the peace it's brought them. And you know, we talk so often about it with more modern wars, the PTSD that our troops face during war and come home to then face many times with not as much help as we should give them. But these World War II veterans, long before people were talking about it, were experiencing many of those same symptoms. And they've been very honest about it here on this trip. It's been profoundly moving to talk to them about it and to see the smiles on their faces now being greeted by the presidents, both of the United States and of France, certainly means the world to them.
Please remain standing for the posting of the colors, the playing of the French and U.S. national anthems, and the invocation.
Veuillez rester debout pour le lever des couleurs, les hymnes nationaux de la France et des États-Unis et l'invocation.
This is David Muir reporting from Normandy, France, and you're watching ABC News live coverage of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. We know many of our stations are just now joining us. And if you are, you can see on the stage there, that's President Emmanuel Macron of France, smiling as he stands before World War II veterans who are here today to be honored for what they did here on that 50-mile stretch of coastline here in Normandy. On those beaches, the code names we're all so familiar with all these years later. President Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump also greeting those veterans, the smiles on their faces. And we've been talking this morning about how many of them were a bit reticent about making that decision, whether or not to come back. They are well into their 90s. But every one of them I've talked to, and look at them, taking photographs, have told me that they are glad they did it. It's brought peace, 75 years in the making.
So proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the invocation offered by the U.S. Army Europe Command Chaplain, Colonel Timothy Mallard.
Mesdames et messieurs,
Colonel Timothy
Mesdames et
Millard,
messieurs, veuillez
Chaplain,
rester
U.S.
debout
Army
pour la
Europe.
prière.
They're now
Donnée
telling the
par
audience in
militaires
French
français
who will be delivering that
forces
invocation.
américaines stationnées en
Colonel
Europe.
Mallard is the
Le
command
colonel
chaplain for the U.S.
Timothy
Army. He's been in Europe since 2018.
Almighty God, Lord of hosts, sacred to us is the memory of our fallen and the sacrifices of our veterans on these waters, shores, fields, and skies. And thus we humbly ask for your holy presence here today in this ceremony. From many nations, their sacrifice, poured out in blood, courage, and even death, to secure liberty for your enslaved children and to smash tyranny, remains our moral touchstone. For so great an act of love, we pray that you will grant them eternal peace and their families lasting comfort. By their courage on D-Day and afterwards, we also pray that you will challenge us to love freedom more than comfort, privilege, or even life itself, and that without thought of cost or reward, we also will recommit ourselves to defend life, liberty, and the pursuit of the common good, no matter the cost. Though we are resolute in our request, O God, we know we cannot achieve this without your divine blessing and guidance. And so lead us as our shepherd, even if it be again through the valley of the shadow of death, towards the green pastures of peaceful freedom. All this we ask, O Father of mercy, in thy holy name. Amen.
Colonel Mallard received the Bronze Star Medal for the 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom. We'll next hear from retired Major General William Matz, Jr. He's the Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission. He's been in this position since he was appointed by President Trump. He'll deliver the welcoming remarks. As the world watches Normandy and marks this day by celebrating the bravery of those World War II veterans.
President and Ms. Macron, President and Ms. Trump, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial in Colville-sur-Mer for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings on 6 June 1944. Today we honor and commemorate the 9,388 interred here, the 1,557 names on the wall of the missing, and all of our World War II veterans.
Monsieur le Président, Madame Macron, Monsieur le Président, Madame Trump, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants officiels, Mesdames et Messieurs, bienvenue au cimetière américain de Normandie de Colville-sur-Mer pour la commémoration du 75e anniversaire du débarquement du jour J, le 6 juin 1944. Aujourd'hui, nous rendons hommage aux 9 388 soldats qui reposent en ce lieu, aux 1557 disparus honorés sur le mur des disparus, ainsi qu'à tous les combattants de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated.
Mesdames et Messieurs, veuillez vous asseoir.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of the American Battle Monuments Commission, William Matz.
Mesdames et Messieurs, le secrétaire de la Commission des Monuments de Guerre, William Matz.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our commemoration ceremony of the Normandy landings. And it is indeed an honor for me to be with you today on these sacred grounds of the Normandy American Cemetery to celebrate the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And we extend a particularly warm welcome to President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, and his wife, Brigitte Macron. And to our President and Commander-in-Chief, Donald J. Trump, and First Lady, Melania Trump. To our many distinguished government and military leaders, and to the families of our honored dead who traveled to these now peaceful and hallowed grounds to bear witness to the valor and the sacrifice of their family heroes resting here. And to the more than 160 World War II veterans seated herein on this stage who need no reminders of the horrors of war and who remember well their comrades who never came home. And folks, a very special welcome to the D-Day veterans present today, approximately 35, who 75 years ago on Omaha and Utah beaches and in nearby landing fields took the first treacherous steps towards liberation as a watchful world anxiously awaited word of their fate. The mission of the American Battle Monuments Commission, folks, is to commemorate and honor the service and sacrifice of United States Armed Forces. We do so by tending the graves and the memorials of our fallen servicemen and women, buried and memorialized at 26 American cemeteries around the world. We do so also by preserving the stories of their deeds and the endeavors of those that fought at their side. Courageous actions that bequeath the blessings of freedom to generations yet unborn. 75 years ago, this very morning, and yards, simply yards from where each of you are sitting, a generation of young American men, joined by French, British, Canadian, and other allied nations, brothers in arms, did the unthinkable and accomplished the impossible. These men came ashore and fought against tyranny in a massive undertaking unparalleled in human history. It was Archibald MacLeish, the World War I veteran, who wrote these words in his poem, The Young Dead Soldiers. They say we were young, we have died, remember us. They say we leave you our deaths, give them their meaning. So many gave us their deaths. It is for us, our children, for generations to come, to give them their meaning. So our presence here today in this beautiful and inspirational cemetery does just that. For the very character of a country can be determined by the way it takes care of its war dead and is a measure of its very heart and soul. To the more than 9,000 Americans who sleep here silently, we give our promise, we will not forget. Each year that we gather here and everywhere they fought and fell, our still grateful hearts are filled by what they did 75 years ago this morning. We shall remember you as when you were reverently, lovingly placed in this hallowed ground. To them and to the World War II veterans with us here today and in spirit around the world, your service, your sacrifice will have meaning so long as those who follow you hold high the torch of freedom that you kept burning through history's darkest hours. Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their valor, borne by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died. And so today I welcome you as we pause for a brief moment to remember and to rededicate our efforts to the promise of our Commission's first chairman, General of the Army's John J. Pershing, that time will not dim the glory of their deeds. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the Republic of France, Emmanuel Macron.
Mesdames et Messieurs, Monsieur Emmanuel Macron, Président de la République française.
Monsieur le Président des États-Unis d'Amérique, cher Donald Trump, Messieurs les combattants du débarquement, chers vétérans, Mesdames, Messieurs, cette nuit, du 5 au 6 juin 1944, la Manche n'était pas seulement troublée par la brume naissante, par la houle soutenue qui agitait les flots salés. Depuis quelques heures, en effet, depuis que le général Eisenhower avait lancé son fameux Let's Go,
roared his famous Let's Go,
1200 bâtiments
some
de guerre,
1,200 warships,
5700 navires de
5,700 freight ships,
canons et
loaded
camions,
with
chars et
cannons
barges
and
d'assaut qui
trucks,
gagnaient,
tanks and landing
précédés de
crafts,
25 flottilles.
following on the heels of
Le sud de
25
l'île de
flotilla,
White.
sailed
En ce
towards
point
the
baptisé
south
par
of the Isle of
l'état-major de
Wight to the
l'opération Overlord,
rendezvous point
Piccadilly Circus.
called by Operation Overlord military staff Piccadilly Circus.
Devant les dizaines de milliers de soldats qui avaient
Ahead
ainsi
of
pris la
the
mer,
tens of thousands of soldiers
rien
who
d'autre
took to
que
the
l'immensité
seas
noire,
lay nothing but massive
à peine
darkness,
éclairée par les lueurs
barely
des navires.
lit by the glowing lamps from the
par la
ships
pleine lune.
and the full moon.
Devant ces soldats,
Ahead of these soldiers, above all,
l'angoisse de l'inconnu.
lay the dread of the unknown.
Quelques heures plus tôt, ils
A few
avaient
hours
appris
earlier,
l'objectif
they
de leur
had learned
mission.
the purpose of their mission.
Mais leur destination,
Their destinations,
Utah,
Omaha, Juneau,
Gold et
Sword,
Sword
and
Beach,
Gold Beach,
sonnaient comme autant
were
d'incertitudes.
shrouded in uncertainty.
Seuls ceux qui avaient participé
Only
quelques
those
mois plus
who,
tôt
a few months earlier, had taken part in the Sicily landings, perhaps had an idea of what was to come, a bitter, difficult battle,
à coup sûr sanglant.
which would certainly claim the lives of many.
Ces milliers de soldats, donc,
Tens of thousands of soldiers, drafted or volunteers,
avaient pour la plupart,
most were
une
barely
vingtaine d'années.
20 years old,
et pourtant,
and yet
ils semblaient déjà loin. Les jours heureux de
their
leur
days of youth seemed far behind them.
les plaines vallonnées de
Far
Pennsylvanie, du
the rolling
Kentucky, du New
hills of
Jersey.
Pennsylvania, Kentucky, or
Loin
New
les années
Jersey.
d'études où ils apprirent un
Far
métier
their school years where they had
qu'ils n'eurent
learned a
parfois
trade
jamais l'occasion d'exercer.
that many had never had a
Loin
chance to
les
practice.
entraînements exigeants
Far from the
commencés
grueling
sur les monts de
training that
Géorgie
had
et
begun in the
poursuivis
mountains of
à
Georgia
mesure que l'opération
and
Bolero les
continued
conduisait à
as
traverser
Operation
l'Atlantique
Bolero
au
brought them
sud de
across the
l'Angleterre.
Atlantic to
Loin,
the south of England.
les mois passés
Far
auprès des Britanniques,
from the months spent
dans
amongst the
l'attente
British
d'une opération
people
dont ils ne
waiting
savaient rien.
for an operation of
Loin.
which they knew nothing.
Les regards inquiets de
Far
leurs
from the
parents,
worried faces of their
moment de leur
parents when they
départ.
left home.
les au revoir déchirants,
Far from the
de leurs
emotional
fiancés.
goodbyes to their fiancés,
Tant et tant, en quittant les côtes
to whom
anglaises, leur avaient
they
écrit
wrote as they left the English
à la flamme
shores
d'une bougie ou d'un
by
briquet.
candlelight or the flickering flame of a
Une ultime
cigarette
lettre
lighter,
poignante.
one last heartbreaking letter.
À quoi songer
What
durant ces heures?
was running through their minds?
Ces jeunes gens glacés
The
par le
minds
froid
of
des
these
millénaires
young
du Nord.
people frozen by the waters of the North
Nul
Sea.
ne le sait.
Who knows?
Nul ne pénètre
Their
l'épaisseur
thoughts
des consciences.
are unfathomable. We cannot plunge the
Et ce qui
minds
frappe
of
encore,
human beings.
75 ans après,
But what resonates
C'est le
still,
courage
75 years later,
la
is
générosité
their incredible courage and
dont ils firent
generosity.
preuve. Il y eut durant ces heures-là comme une force qui allait et
The
qui portait chacun vers
fortitude
son destin.
that carried them towards their
C'est cette force
destiny,
d'âme qui les
that
conduisit là, à des
fortitude
milliers de
that had
kilomètres de
taken
chez
them
eux,
thousands of miles
pour
from
porter
home
secours
to
à des
provide
femmes et des hommes
assistance
qu'ils
to
ne
men and
connaissaient
women
pas,
whom they did not
pour
know,
libérer une terre
to free a
qu'ils
land
n'avaient pour la plupart jamais
they had
foulée,
never set foot
sans
in,
autre boussole
with
qu'une
no
cause qu'ils
other
savaient plus
compass than a
importante que
cause that they knew was greater
celle de la
than
liberté,
themselves, the cause of liberty
celle de la
and
démocratie.
democracy.
Alors aujourd'hui,
Today, France has not forgotten. France has not forgotten those fighters to whom we owe the right to live in freedom. We have not forgotten the 135,000 American, British and Canadian soldiers, backed by Belgium, Luxembourg, Dutch, Norwegian, Danish, Polish, Czechoslovak, Australian, New Zealand, South African and French troops, landed on the 6th of June on the beaches of Normandy and forever changed the course of history in Europe and the world. France has not forgotten the thousands of paratroopers who just a few hours earlier had been dropped behind the lines and, with the support of the French resistance fighters, would take hold of strategic bridges, roads and railway lines and would take over from their brothers in arms who made it out alive from the emerald shores, crimsoned by the shed blood. France has not forgotten the 2 million soldiers who, at the end of this longest day, would continue fighting on for weeks to free the towns and villages of Normandy and would go through the hell of combat in the Normandy countryside, which was even more treacherous than the combat on the beaches. On behalf of my country, on behalf of France, I bow down before their bravery. I bow down before the immense sacrifice of the 37,000 killed, the 19,000 reported missing who died as heroes in Normandy between June and August 1944, and who, for many, were to rest there for eternity. I bow down to our veterans, and I say thank you.
We know what we owe to you, veterans, our freedom. On behalf of my nation, I just want to say thank you.
President Emmanuel Macron here in France, telling those World War II veterans from D-Day, France has not forgotten the more than 100,000 who landed here on these beaches and forever changed the course of victory. He said he bows down before them, before their bravery, their sacrifice, and to those who did not go home, who are still here.
Many of our veterans are here in this cemetery of equals, and they died for our freedom. They are your brothers in arms. They are those who you, Vincent Hines, attempted to save. You volunteered to take part in the second Omaha wave. On this 6th of June, you put yourself at great risk to remove the wounded from the beach under the hail of German fire. The brothers in arms with whom you, dear Paul Worth, fought from this same Omaha beach, right through to the Walloon region of Belgium, on the way participating in the Battle of Carentan and the Avranches breakthrough that would free the Brittany region. Your brothers in arms, those who you, dear Charles Duro, accompanied through the treacherous Normandy countryside, you who fought non-stop from the 7th of June through to the 8th of July, the brothers in arms who accompanied you for some to the Ardennes region, Luxembourg, and even the countryside of Czechoslovakia, those brothers in arms who saved you, Stanley Friday, when you were wounded twice in the Saint-Lô region and then in the Ardennes, and who gave you the strength to head back into combat until you crossed the Rhine River, where you took part in the liberation of the concentration camps and saw the faces of the survivors and the faces of the executioners alike. And maybe then, in the raw truth of that moment, you understood what you were fighting for. Your brothers in arms, of you too, Harold Terrence, You worked first as a radio operator, and then you deliberately decided to go to France to lead military operations in Normandy, Reims, and in the Rhine region. Dear Vincent Hines, dear Paul Worth, dear Charles Duro, dear Stanley Friday, dear Harold Terrence, in recognition of your unwavering efforts for France to regain its freedom, I will, in just a few minutes, award you the Order of the Knights of the Legion d'Honneur. The Legion of Honor is the highest distinction awarded by the French Republic. It commends your extraordinary action, your courage, your contribution to the liberation of our country. It is a way for the French nation to say once again, and 75 years later, that we know what we owe to the United States of America. The United States of America, dear Donald Trump, dear President, which is never greater than when it is fighting for the freedom of others. The United States of America, that is never greater than when it shows its loyalty to the universal values that the Founding Fathers defended, when nearly 2.5 centuries ago, France came to support its independence. But we owe you more. We owe you more. Sir. We owe you, all those who fought, the thousands of civilians who lost their lives and who I have not forgotten. We owe more than medals and words. What we owe you is to show ourselves worthy of the heritage of peace that you have left us, our debt, worthy of the promise of Normandy. Being worthy of the promise of Normandy means never forgetting that free peoples, when they join forces, can surmount any adversity. The victory against barbarism would never have been possible without the decisive support of the United States, without the millions of committed men and women, without the support of the American people and American industry. On the beaches of the Channel, in the green Normandy countryside, and the highest levels of the military, the armed forces were united. The Allied armed forces were united. It is because the Royal Air Force assisted the Canadian infantry, because the French resistance fighters opened up the lines in Brittany and Normandy and elsewhere to the United States armed forces. In decisive moments of the battle, Australians, people from New Zealand, Denmark, and Norwegian Navy officers and Dutch airmen arrived. In the interminable battle of the Falaise Gap, the Polish tanks made all the difference. And it's because of that that this wild gamble to free Europe from the Nazis' hold by way of the sea could be won. We shall never cease to perpetuate the alliance of free peoples. That is what the victorious sides did. Immediately after the Germans and the Japanese surrendered, when they created the United Nations. That is what the United States did when it created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is what, a few years later, the leaders of Europe did in bringing about the European Union. France wishes to continue to support this promise of Normandy, understand its purpose. This is what we owe to our homeland, what we owe to countries that share the same values, what we owe to democracy and liberty. The lessons of Colville-sur-Mer are clear. Liberty and democracy are inseparable. Young Americans died here. They died for their country, and they died for the freedom of the world. They knew that. The French, who died on the same beaches by their side, fell for the liberation of their country. But they also fell so that their nation, once this task completed, would to rediscover its tradition of liberty. We need to be true to their memory. And to do that, we must never sacrifice what we must never renounce what their sacrifice united. The promise of Normandy will be supported by France with all its might. I promise that this will be the case. And this is at the heart of America's destiny too. President of the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, all along the roads of France, the beaches from Cotentin to Cherbourg, from Cherbourg to Avranches, from Avranches to Metz, and Metz to Bastogne. Along those roads taken by the heroes we're honoring here today, as of the summer 1944, all along we see hundreds of milestones. They are decorated with the stars of the American flag and with the flame of the Statue of Liberty, that statue that one of our greatest sculptors gave to the city of New York. These stone monuments serve as a reminder, an indelible reminder, inscribed in the countryside of France, a reminder of what our country owes the United States of America. Their presence resonates. It's an invitation to us to continue renew this secular pact that unites France, the United States of America, and freedom. I am ready, Mr. President of the United States of America, dear Donald Trump. The people of France are ready to renew this friendship between our nations that has contributed so much to the history of humanity and that the world expects so much from. We are ready, and we will do this. Thank you. Long live the United States of America. Vive la République. Vive la France, and long live the friendship between our two nations.
President Emmanuel Macron shaking hands with President Trump, speaking of the relationship between France and the United States, talking about the young Americans who died here. He said they died for America, but they also died for freedom all across the world. He also talked about the Americans he will present with the Legion of Honor, the highest French decoration. Only about 320 foreigners have actually received this medal. As he prepares to honor each of them, we want to remind you of their names: Vincent Hines, Stanley Friday, Harold Terrans, Charles Giroux, and Mal Worth. And I want to share with you, we sat down with Stanley Friday just yesterday.
Monsieur
and in a sign of how modest,
au nom de la République française,
humble these men are,
nous vous faisons
he didn't mention this medal.
De la Légion d'honneur.
Awarded Knight of the Legion of Honor.
Monsieur Stanley Friday.
Stanley Friday.
Au nom de la République
française. On behalf of the French Republic.
Nous vous faisons chevalier.
I award you the distinction of Knight of the Legion of Honor.
Stanley Friday is 96 years old, and at 21, he would go ahead Ahead through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, scouting past 2 concentration camps the Americans would later liberate. Profound bravery on his part, and bravery he did not speak of when
Charles
we talked
Giraud,
with him.
in the name of the French Republic, I make you Knight of the Legion of Honor.
Monsieur Harold Terrence,
Mr. Harold
au nom de la
Terrence,
République
in the name
française,
of the French Republic,
nous vous faisons chevalier de la Légion
make you
d'honneur.
Knight of the Legion of Honor.
Monsieur Paul Worth,
Paul Worth,
au nom de la République
in
française,
the name of the French Republic,
nous vous faisons chevalier
we
de
make
la
you
Légion
Knight
d'honneur.
of the Legion of Honor.
Paul Worth there at the end, an extraordinary display of the relationship between these two countries, whispering into the ear of President Trump. And it was President Macron who said, "We owe you more than medals and words. We must remember the heritage of peace that you all provided."
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Donald.
Mesdames et messieurs, Monsieur Donald J. Trump, président des États-Unis.
President Macron, Mrs. Macron, and the people of France, to the First Lady of the United States and members of the United States Congress, to distinguished guests, veterans, and my fellow Americans, we are gathered here on freedom's altar, on these shores, on these bluffs, on this day 75 years ago. 10,000 men shed their blood and thousands sacrificed their lives for their brothers, for their countries, and for the survival of liberty. Today we remember those who fell, and we honor all who fought right here in Normandy. They won back this ground for civilization to more than 170 veterans of the Second World War who join us today. You are among the very greatest Americans who will ever live. You are the pride of our nation. You are the glory of our republic. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Here with you are over 60 veterans who landed on D-Day. Our debt to you is everlasting. Today we express our undying gratitude. When you were young, these men enlisted their lives in a great crusade, one of the greatest of all times. Their mission is the story of an epic battle and the ferocious, eternal struggle between good and evil. On the 6th of June, 1944, they joined a liberation force of awesome power and breathtaking scale. After months of planning, the Allies had chosen this ancient coastline to mount their campaign to vanquish the wicked tyranny of the Nazi Empire from the face of the earth. The battle began in the skies above us. In those first tense midnight hours, 1,000 aircraft roared overhead with 17,000 Allied airborne troops preparing to leap into the darkness beyond these trees. Then came dawn. The enemy who had occupied these heights saw the largest naval armada in the history of the world. Just a few miles offshore were 7,000 vessels bearing 130,000 warriors. They were the citizens of free and independent nations united by their duty to their compatriots into millions yet unborn. There were the British whose nobility and fortitude saw them through the worst of Dunkirk and the London Blitz. The full violence of Nazi fury was no match for the full grandeur of British pride. Thank you. There were the Canadians whose robust sense of honor and loyalty compelled them to take up arms alongside Britain from the very, very beginning. There were the fighting Poles, the tough Norwegians, and the intrepid Aussies. There were the gallant French commandos, soon to be met by thousands of their brave countrymen ready to write a new chapter in the long history of French valor. And finally, there were the Americans. They came from the farms of a vast heartland, the streets of glowing cities, and the forges of mighty industrial towns. Before the war, many had never ventured beyond their own community. Now they had come to offer their lives half a world from home. This beach, codenamed Omaha, was defended by the Nazis with monstrous firepower, thousands and thousands of mines and spikes driven into the sand so deeply. It was here that tens of thousands of the Americans came. The GIs who boarded the landing craft that morning knew that they carried on their shoulders not just the pack of a soldier, but the fate of the world. Colonel George Taylor, whose 16th Infantry Regiment would join in the first wave, was asked what would happen if the Germans stopped. Right then and there, cold on the beach, just stopped them. What would happen? This great American replied, "Why, the 18th Infantry is coming in right behind us. The 26th Infantry will come on too. Then there is the 2nd Infantry Division, already afloat, and the 9th Division, and the 2nd Armored, and the 3rd Armored, and all the rest. Maybe the 16th won't make it, but someone will. One of those men in Taylor's 16th Regiment was Army medic Ray Lambert. Ray was only 23, but he had already earned 3 Purple Hearts and 2 Silver Stars fighting in North Africa and Sicily, where he and his brother Bill, no longer with us, served side by side. In the early morning hours, the 2 brothers stood together on the deck of the USS Enrico before boarding 2 separate Higgins landing craft. "If I don't make it," Bill said, "please, please take care of my family." Ray asked his brother to do the same. Of the 31 men on Ray's landing craft, only Ray and 6 others made it to the beach. There were only a few of them left. They came to the sector right here below us. Easy Red, it was called. Again and again, Ray ran back into the water. He dragged out one man after another. He was shot through the arm. His leg was ripped open by shrapnel. His back was broken. He nearly drowned. He had been on the beach for hours, bleeding and saving lives, when he finally lost consciousness. He woke up the next day on a cot beside another badly wounded soldier. He looked over and saw his brother Bill. They made it. They made it. They made it. At 98 years old, Ray is here with us today with his 4th Purple Heart and his 3rd Silver Star from Omaha. Ray, the free world salutes you. Thank you, Ray. Nearly 2 hours in, unrelenting fire from these bluffs kept the Americans pinned down on the sand, now red with our heroes' blood. Then, just a few hundred yards from where I'm standing, a breakthrough came. The battle turned, and with it, history. Down on the beach, Captain Joe Dawson, the son of a Texas preacher, led Company G through a minefield to a natural fold in the hillside, still here. Just beyond this path, to my right, Captain Dawson snuck beneath an enemy machine gun perch and tossed his grenades. Soon American troops were charging up Dawson's Draw. What a job he did. What bravery he showed. Lieutenant Spaulding and the men from Company E moved on to crush the enemy's strong point on the far side of this cemetery and stop the slaughter on the beach below. Countless more Americans poured out across this ground all over the countryside. They joined fellow American warriors from Utah Beach and allies from Juneau, Sword and Gold, along with the airborne and the French patriots. Private First Class Russell Pickett of the 29th Division's famed 116th Infantry Regiment had been wounded in the first wave that landed on Omaha Beach. At a hospital in England, Private Pickett vowed to return to battle. "I'm going to return," he said. "I'm going to return." 6 days after D-Day, he rejoined his company. 2/3 had been killed already. Many had been wounded within 15 minutes of the invasion. They lost 19 just from the small town of Bedford, Virginia alone. Before long, a grenade left Private Pickett, and he was gravely wounded, so badly wounded. Again, he chose to return. He didn't care. He had to be here. He was then wounded a third time and laid unconscious for 12 days. They thought he was gone. They thought he had no chance. Russell Pickett is the last known survivor of the legendary Company A. And today, believe it or not, he has returned once more to these shores to be with his comrades. Private Pickett, you honor us all with your presence. Tough guy. By the fourth week of August, Paris was liberated. Some who landed here pushed all the way to the center of Germany. Some threw open the gates of Nazi concentration camps to liberate Jews who had suffered the bottomless horrors of the Holocaust. And some warriors fell on other fields of battle, returning to rest on this soil for eternity. Before this place was consecrated to history, the land was owned by a French farmer, a member of the French resistance. These were great people. These were strong and tough people. His terrified wife waited out D-Day in a nearby house, holding tight to their little baby girl. The next day, a soldier appeared. "I'm an American," he said. "I'm here to help." The French woman was overcome with emotion and cried. Days later, she laid flowers on fresh American graves. Today, her granddaughter, Stephanie, serves as a guide at this cemetery. This week, Stephanie led 92-year-old Marion Wynn of California to see the grave of her brother, Don, for the very first time. Marion and Stephanie are both with us today, and we thank you for keeping alive the memories of our precious heroes. Thank you. $9,388 young Americans rest beneath the white crosses and stars of David, arrayed on these beautiful grounds. Each one has been adopted by a French family that thinks of him as their own. They come from all over France to look after our boys. They kneel, they cry, they pray, they place flowers, and they never forget. Today, America embraces the French people and thanks you for honoring our beloved dead. Thank you. To all of our friends and partners, our cherished alliance was forged in the heat of battle, tested in the trials of war, and proven in the blessings of peace. Our bond is unbreakable. From across the earth, Americans are drawn to this place as though it were a part of our very soul. We come not only because of what they did here, we come because of who they were. They were young men with their entire lives before them. They were husbands who said goodbye to their young brides and took their duty as their fate. They were fathers who would never meet their infant sons and daughters because they had a job to do. And with God as their witness, they were going to get it done. They came wave after wave, without question, without hesitation, and without complaint. More powerful than the strength of American arms was the strength of American hearts. These men ran through the fires of hell, moved by a force no weapon could destroy. The fierce patriotism of a free, proud, and sovereign people. They battled not for control and domination, but for liberty, democracy, and self-rule. They pressed on for love and home and country, the main streets, the schoolyards, the churches, and neighbors, the families and communities that gave us men such as these. They were sustained by the confidence that America can do anything, because we are a noble nation with a virtuous people praying to a righteous God. The exceptional might came from a truly exceptional spirit. The abundance of courage came from an abundance of faith. The great deeds of an army came from the great depths of their love. As they confronted their fate, the Americans and the Allies placed themselves into the palm of God's hand. The men behind me will tell you that they are just the lucky ones. As one of them recently put it, all the heroes are buried here. But we know what these men did. We knew how brave they were. They came here and saved freedom. And then they went home and showed us all what freedom is all about. The American sons and daughters who saw us to victory were no less extraordinary in peace. They built families. They built industries. They built a national culture that inspired the entire world. In the decades that followed, America defeated communism, secured civil rights, revolutionized science, launched a man to the moon, and then kept on pushing to new frontiers. And today, America is stronger than ever before. Seven decades ago, the warriors of D-Day fought a sinister enemy who spoke of a 1,000-year empire. In defeating that evil, they left a legacy that will last not only for 1,000 years, but for all time. For as long as the soul knows of duty and honor, for as long as freedom keeps its hold on the human heart. To the men who sit behind me and to the boys who rest in the field before me, your example will never, ever grow old. Your legend will never die. Your spirit, brave, unyielding, and true, will never die. The blood that they spilled, the tears that they shed, the lives that they gave, the sacrifice that they made, did not just win a battle. It did not just win a war. Those who fought here won a future for our nation. They won the survival of our civilization. And they showed us the way to love, cherish, and defend our way of life for many centuries to come. Today, as we stand together upon this sacred earth, we pledge that our nation will forever be strong and united. We will forever be together. Our people will forever be bold. Our hearts will forever be loyal. And our children and their children will forever and always be free. May God bless our great veterans. May God bless our allies. May God bless the heroes of D-Day. And may God bless America. Thank you. Thank you very much.
President Trump here in Normandy, France, standing before survivors of D-Day, embracing President Macron of France right there, telling those World War II veterans you are the pride of the nation, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. He also talked about the 9,388 young Americans who rest beneath the beautiful grounds here, as he said, each adopted by a French family.
En l'honneur et en la mémoire de ceux qui ont consenti l'ultime sacrifice au service de la France et des États-Unis, le président de la République française et le président des États-Unis vont maintenant déposer une gerbe, puis observer un moment de silence.
Ouais, faut le dire à Arthur.
Of course, now they prepare for the wreath laying and then a moment of silence. And the president saying, as he stands before those veterans right there behind him, these men will tell you that they are the lucky ones. All of the heroes are actually buried here. But he said those men saved freedom, and they showed us when they came home what freedom is all about.
Seated as Presidents Macron and President Trump greet the World War II veterans.
President Trump and the First Lady, Melania Trump, President Macron and Brigitte Macron greeting those D-Day survivors and World War II veterans on the stage behind them. And Terry Moran, who's watching here with me in Normandy, it is hard not to be moved by those stories and those D-Day survivors who stood up after President Trump shared their stories.
You know, it's so beautiful, David, to hear both President Macron and President Trump in these speeches try to take us back, try to take us all back to when these men were young men, heroes, boys in some ways, and put ourselves in their place as they stormed the beaches and fought their way to Germany. And to hear those individual stories was very powerful. I think this is one of the most significant speeches that President Trump has given, because he wove out of those individual stories his vision of of what America First means to him. In the inauguration, he talked about it, about what needed to be repaired, the American carnage. That was a very controversial way of putting it. This is what can be achieved if we can return to those traditions that he believes in. The boldness, the loyalty, and loyalty to allies as well. I think this speech will go down in his presidency as a statement of his vision based on what those heroes did of what America can be.
But as you point out, Terry, he talked about the age of these men who now stand behind him on that stage, who now accept his embrace, his handshake with smiles on their faces. They were 18, 19, 20 years old. Many of them had yet to get married. Some were newly married. Some left before they even had a chance to start families, knowing that the fate awaited them, an uncertain fate, in fact. But he also said that our bond is unbreakable. Terry, as you said, taking advantage of this opportunity on a world stage to talk about relationships, and one that he will continue to be committed to with President Macron.
In his way, based on his vision, which is not Macron's vision, but certainly that emotion, that bond and solidarity between the United States and France and the rest of Europe, he touched on that. And just on a personal note, when he made that point about young soldiers getting married before they shipped off, that's what my dad did. He served in World War II, and my mom and dad, they got married 2 weeks before he shipped off to the Pacific Theater, Okinawa and the Philippines. I think because they wanted to be together before perhaps he fought and died. And that was true of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young men and young women. And I think it was very touching to me to hear President Trump articulate that almost unnoticed aspect of heroism, one act of love before they shipped out.
Well, we salute your father too here this morning, Terry. I know you lost him when you were young, and in talking about these soldiers who were so young, you know, many of them here in our conversations with them have shared with us the mementos they saved. And Martha Raddatz, who's been listening with us all morning long, our chief global affairs correspondent. Martha, one soldier shared with me the letter he wrote to his mother. He said, "Dear Mom," and this was just days after D-Day, he said, perhaps I should let you know I'm in France. But he said, I have to leave the bloody details to Leo, which was his brother. He thought at the time descriptions of war were only something he could share with his brother. There was so much protecting, even at such a young age. These young men wanted to protect their families back home, their mothers back home, their young wives back home from the horrors that they had witnessed here.
And that is still the same today, David. It is something they can share with those who shared it with them, and very few others. Very few people can ever understand what these men went through. We're all learning more about that today. You heard President Trump say that fathers died who would never meet their sons and daughters, wave after wave coming on that beach. Those who fought here want a future for our nation, and I could not stop looking at the faces of those men and thinking of the pride or the healing, as you said earlier, the healing that events like this bring to them, coming back to where they fought. You know, they do that sometimes today. They try to take young soldiers back to the battlefields. It's obviously very, very difficult to go back to Afghanistan or Iraq and see where it's fought or lost others. But it is such a powerful and profound moment for those soldiers to go back and to remember and to bond with those who they fought with.
You know, they have earned this day, and it's wonderful to witness. It is powerful to witness, and many of us standing here wish it hadn't taken 75 years for many of them to feel this moment of closure. But we certainly welcome it for them, those who've made the trip for the first time. We just saw our friend Harold McMurrin there with a smile on his face. He was the one in the lower right corner of your screen there smiling at President Macron. And he was the one who thought at the last minute, do I really want to go? Told me yesterday he's glad he came. Then there was Harold Himmelsbach, who came as well. He was the one who protected his mother all those years ago. He actually has to get home after this ceremony. He will mark his 70th wedding anniversary, and I told Harold that I hope somebody's doing the planning for you. You've got your hands full here, marking D-Day. And Cokie Roberts, who has been listening with us for our coverage as well. Cokie, you know, Harold told me himself that he's 93, turning 94. He guesses this is the last time he'll be here. And he said, I know the ranks are growing smaller and smaller. We lose more than 300 World War II veterans in the United States every year, every day.
It's true, and you know, one of the things that we are privileged to see in Washington is the World War II veterans coming to the new memorial that's been built in honor of the people who fought in that war, and the fewer and fewer of them obviously can come. But you know, I was struck with listening to what Terry was talking about his dad. When we were growing up in America in the 1950s, every house, there was not a house that you went into that did not have men in uniform in pictures all around the house, because that's who they were. Everybody had fought in that war, and everybody had sacrificed for the war in our country. And what you heard today was not only tributes to the men who did that, and some women. I should point out there are 4 women buried in that beautiful cemetery, including African-American female soldiers. But what the vision and the meaning of this day is clearly very different to our 2 presidents. And President Trump did talk about American strength and how America went forward from there to be this very strong nation that could put a man on the moon and all of that. Whereas President Macron talked about the promise of Normandy. And to him, the promise of Normandy was a world united, where people came together as they did fighting on those fields. And he talked about the institutions created as a result of that, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and yes, the European Union, something that President Trump has railed against. It is a vision that is born out of that place, out of that sacred ground, but 2 very different visions.
Cokie, I'm watching President Macron now make his way through a sea of American World War II veterans, those D-Day survivors, and they have giant smiles. And I'll tell you, the veterans here have shared the same story over and over, how moved they are by the gratitude they sense from the French. We know back home the pride we have in America for our World War II veterans, but when they come here to France and to Normandy, they hear from the French right away. Thank you. Thank you for what you did 75 years ago. We saw Onofrio Zakari there a moment ago, one of the gentlemen that we have followed. He was so happy, had his hand on the shoulder of the French president, President Macron, who surely was thanking the American veterans for what they did. They now prepare for that wreath laying and a moment of silence after what has been a powerful and in many ways joyful ceremony.
Please rise and remain standing as we salute those whose final resting place is this hallowed ground.
Veuillez vous lever et restez debout alors que l'on salue ceux dont la dernière demeure est celle de la famille.
Forget.
President Trump and the First Lady, President Macron and Brigitte Macron, they will leave the stage area. They're going to be walking towards Omaha Beach. And there you have it, the 21-gun salute.
Please be seated while the official party moves to the orientation map at the overlook.
They will now make their way to Omaha Beach. It's extraordinary to think of the numbers when you think back to Omaha Beach. Of course, there were several beaches that were stormed that morning 75 years ago. 34,250 Americans landed on Omaha Beach. Only 2 of the 29 amphibious tanks even made it to land using their own power because of the mine explosions and the incoming fire that they faced at Omaha. And when you see the beach and you see those cliffs, Koki, it really gives you profound respect for what those 18-year-olds, those 19-year-olds accomplished.
Right. It's, I mean, we keep using the word extraordinary because it was. And the fact that they survived at all is remarkable. And then that they were able to do what they did. I mean, it is totally true that what they did was liberate Europe. Think about it. I mean, think what Hitler had done, how much he had taken over the continent. And among other things, that day, D-Day, hastened the liberation of the concentration camps. And people were saved there as well. I mean, coming up those cliffs, those sheer cliffs, with machine gun fire coming down on you and landmines exploding around you, saved the world.
A poignant moment here in Normandy has been the whole morning here as we've watched the world pay tribute to World War II veterans who changed the course of history. They're looking out over Omaha Beach. Of course, we listen to taps. There will be a flyover to come. These 2 world leaders standing together as they told the crowd and the world watching. President Macron saying, "Today, France has not forgotten what happened 75 years ago this